The crown hit the ground before anyone understood what was happening. 3,000 soldiers stood frozen on a battlefield still wet with blood, and in the middle of it all, the Alpha King turned his back on the council that had made him, stripped the title from his own hands, and said the words of surrender in front of every witness they had. Not to an enemy. Not to save himself. He said them looking at her. The woman he had sent away. The woman who had built an army from nothing while he said nothing. She was standing 60 feet away with a sword in her hand, and no reason left to trust him, and he chose that exact moment, in front of 3,000 people, to destroy everything he had left. Why? What did he know that no one else on that battlefield could see, and would she believe him in time? Watch to find out. Rain found every gap in the old stone, and the candle on the windowsill kept guttering each time the draft pushed through. Seraphine turned a page without reading it, listening instead to the wet rhythm against the glass. The door opened without a knock. It never needed one, and the smell of iron and rain came in before he did. She didn't look up. She knew the weight of his step, the particular way armor settled when a man peeled it off piece by piece, too tired to do it properly. He sat beside her without a word. His hand found the edge of the blanket, then her knee, then stilled there, as if he'd run out of momentum halfway through a thought. She turned to another page she hadn't read. After a while she let her head drop against his shoulder, eyes still on the book. The fire popped once low, and settled into ash. This was the only hour in which they were simply two people in a room. No court watched. No title stood between them. If anyone had seen them like this, her hair loose, his collar open, the quiet so complete it had its own texture, they would not have recognized either of them. She fell asleep first. She always did. She woke because his hand had gone rigid around hers. The room was darker now, the candle long dead, the rain softer but steady. Selim lay on his back, staring at the ceiling beams, as if they held an answer he refused to read. His grip had tightened, not painfully, but with a pressure that meant something, the kind of grip a man uses when he's holding on to the last solid thing in a collapsing room. What happened today? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough that she heard the rain change pitch, heavier then lighter again. The council made their decision. His voice didn't sound like a king's. It sounded like a man carrying something heavy enough to bend his spine. Tomorrow I have to announce it before the court. She understood before he finished. She understood and asked anyway, because some part of her needed to hear the words leave his mouth, needed proof that this wasn't a misread shadow, a trick of half-sleep. His hand loosened. Not suddenly. Slowly, finger by finger, the way a man sets down something he's carried so long his hand has shaped itself around it. He let go of her hand entirely, and the space where his fingers had been felt colder than the rest of the bed. She sat up. She did not raise her voice. She did not reach for him. She rose, pulled her robe from the chair and crossed to the window. The glass was cold under her palm. Below, the courtyard torches hissed against the rain. How long have you known? Her voice was calm in a way that should have warned him. 3 weeks. The number landed harder than the decision itself. 3 weeks of this same bed, this same hand finding hers in the dark, this same quiet, and he had carried this the entire time. Said nothing. Let her believe the floor beneath them was solid. You lay beside me for 3 weeks, knowing this, and said nothing. Because I didn't want to lose a single one of those days? It was, she realized, the truest thing he had ever said to her. And it was exactly what she could not forgive because it was true, and because it had come 3 weeks too late to mean anything, except a confession of cowardice dressed as devotion. The morning came gray and indifferent, the rain finally tapering to a fine mist. By the time the court assembled, Seraphine had already dressed the deep blue she'd worn for state occasions, her hair bound in the formal style the position required, and had already arranged her face into something the room could not read. There was no gasp when Selim unrolled the decree. No collective intake of breath directed at her, no murmurs of pity or speculation. She had already absorbed the blow in private, in the dark, with the rain as the only witness. What remained now was only the performance of receiving it in public, and she had had all night to rehearse every detail of it, the angle of her chin, the stillness of her hands, the precise moment to breathe. By the time she dressed, by the time she had walked the length of the corridor and taken her place in the hall, the thing had already happened. This was merely the ceremony of it. The hall was full. Banners hung heavy and damp from the rafters, the morning light filtering gray through the high windows. Selim stood at the dais and began to read in the formal cadence, the position demanded clear, measured, betraying nothing of the night before. His eyes found her twice while he read. Both times, brief a flicker, no longer than a heartbeat, easily missed by anyone not watching closely. She did not meet them either time. She kept her gaze fixed on a point just past his shoulder, on the worn stone of the wall, anywhere that wasn't his face. When the last syllable of the decree had been spoken, and the hall held that particular silence which followed an announcement everyone had half expected, and no one had wanted confirmed, she walked the length of the hall. Each step, measured, the soft sound of her shoes against stone the only sound in the chamber. She stopped before him close enough that she could smell faintly, the rain still clinging to his coat from the night before. She held his gaze for one long moment, longer than protocol required, longer than was comfortable, long enough that a few in the court shifted, sensing something passing between these two figures that the decree, for all its formal language, could not touch and had no power over. She slid the ring from her finger. It came away easily, and she placed it in his open palm. Her fingers brushed his skin for exactly 1 second, long enough to feel its warmth one final time, to memorize it the way a person memorizes the temperature of a room they know they will never enter again. "Whoever you mean to keep this for," she said. Quiet, pitched only for him beneath the weight of 300 watching eyes. "Keep it." She turned and walked out, not fast, not slow, and did not look back. But every step of the way she could feel his eyes on her spine like a brand, like something that would leave a mark long after the moment itself had ended. She did not stop walking until she was well outside the castle walls, in the rain, with no one watching at all. The forest did not care what she had lost. It only cared whether she could survive the night, and by the second hour it had made its opinion clear, her dress torn at the hem, a long scratch opening across her shin where she'd misjudged a fallen branch in the dark. The first night, something found her. A rogue wolf, gaunt-ribbed and starving, came at her from the tree line with no warning beyond a snapped twig. She didn't think so. Her body moved on instinct alone, instinct that, until that moment, she had never needed outside a sparring ring with padded blades and a watching trainer. When it was over, she sat very still beside the body, breathing hard, waiting for the horror to arrive. It didn't come. What arrived instead was a colder recognition. She felt nothing. No grief for the animal, no revulsion at her own hands. Just the steady thud of her heart slowing back to normal. And underneath it, something that had not existed in her this morning. The understanding that she had crossed a line, and the line had not hurt as much as she'd expected. She found a shallow cave before the rain returned, and tore a strip from her ruined skirt to bind the cut on her arm. Her fingers worked the knot slowly, methodically, and somewhere in the rhythm of it, a memory surfaced uninvited. Salem's hands, the first time he'd bandaged her after a sparring session gone wrong. His fingers were thick, calloused from the sword, not built for delicacy. But he had moved slowly that day, carefully, as if afraid that speed itself might cause her pain. She pulled the knot tight, tighter than necessary. The memory closed like a door, but the ache it left behind didn't. That night, she dreamed not of the court, not of the decree being read aloud. She dreamed of the night before, of his hand around hers in the dark, tightening, then loosening. In the dream she didn't sit up. She stayed still, eyes closed, and let him hold her hand until morning. She woke with that feeling still warm in her chest, and it was worse, far worse than anything he had actually done. The Rhine ran fast and gray at the border, swollen from days of rain. Seraphine saw the chase before she understood what she was seeing, a figure stumbling along the bank, soldiers closing in with the unhurried confidence of men who had done this before. She didn't decide to help. Her body decided for her, the way it had decided about the wolf. By the time the soldiers were dealt with, the man on the ground was staring up at her with an expression she recognized, not fear, not gratitude. Recognition. "I've seen you," he said, voice rough. "In the palace halls? You're the Luna who left." "I am no longer Luna." The words came out flat, automatic. "No." He pushed himself up slowly, wincing. "You're something stronger than that now." His name was Brennan, and the scar across his throat looked old enough to have a story attached to it. The kind of scar that had been earned, not suffered. Two more came out of the trees before dusk. A tall woman with red hair and the bearing of someone who had been a soldier her entire life, and a boy 19, maybe younger, whose left hand ended in a wrapped stump. The woman introduced herself as Ildra. She'd been watching from the tree line before Seraphine had even reached the riverbank, sword already half drawn, waiting to see if intervention was needed. The boy said little. His name was Finn, and even injured, even exhausted, he carried a small leather book tucked against his ribs. His eyes moved constantly, taking in faces, gestures, the angle of the firelight, as if everything around him was material to be recorded before it disappeared. That night, around a small fire, Seraphine set Finn's broken arm herself. The bone had shifted under the skin, a wrongness she could feel through her fingertips before she could see it, and Ildra's hands shook too badly to be trusted with the work. She tore strips from what remained of her sleeve, soaked them in the cold water Brennan brought from the river, and laid them along the break. Finn's breath hissed through his teeth, but he didn't pull away. He watched her hands instead, the way she worked, unhurried, methodical, as if her fingers had done this before in some other life. He learned everything quickly, Brennan said, watching her work, when he believed it mattered. She kept her hands steady on the splint. Phew. Salem, I taught him the sword before. He was alpha at 22, too young, too untested, and the council knew it. I told them so. They didn't appreciate the honesty. Brennan's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. He couldn't stop them from sending me away. Not then. He didn't have the power yet. Her hands didn't pause on the splint, but her breath changed just slightly, a fraction shorter. The kind of breath someone takes when a door they thought was closed creaks open an inch. The fire spat coal onto the dirt. Brennan noticed the breath. He said nothing more, only watched the flames. Finn watched her face the entire time, his good hand curled loosely in his lap, the splinted one resting against his chest. When she finished tying off the bandage, he asked, "Does it hurt?" She frowned slightly. "I'm not the one injured." "I know." His eyes didn't move from hers, dark and steady in a face too young for the weight behind them. "Does it hurt?" She understood then what he was asking. The river kept moving behind them, indifferent. The honesty of it, coming from someone so young, someone she'd known for less than a day, caught her off guard in a way the wolf attack hadn't. "Not yet," she said finally, and looked down at her own hands instead of his face. "It's still numb." Finn didn't push further. He only nodded once, as if filing the answer away somewhere, and reached for his book with his good hand. Later by the fire, he wrote while the others talked. When she asked what he was recording, he answered without looking up. History. Someone has to write it down. History of what? You. What are you going to do? She studied him as this thin, solemn boy with one hand and an old soul. You don't know what I'm going to do. No. He turned a page. But I'll be here to watch. The valley sat hidden deep in the Schwarzwald, 3 days' walk east of Hagen's territory, a basin of old stone and older trees, untouched by any banner. Eisenhollow, Brennan said, looking out over it. Iron, not silver. Iron isn't beautiful, but it outlasts everything. Seraphine looked at the broken walls of something long abandoned, the wild grass growing through cracked foundations, and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt since the night the rain wouldn't stop. Eisenhollow, she repeated. They were not alone for long. A group of 7 arrived within the first week, servants from a holding. The council had erased after its alpha, refused to pay tribute. None of them were fighters. All of them knew how to build, how to plant, how to cook, how to mend. Watching them unload what little they'd carried, Seraphine understood something she hadn't expected. She needed people who could build a life more than she needed people who could end one. A man among the new arrivals asked at the gate, "Who rules here?" "No one," Seraphine said. "And everyone." He looked confused. She didn't elaborate. "You'll understand in a week," she said, and walked past him into the valley that, by nightfall, had a name. That afternoon, Brennan worked through a series of sword forms with her new ones, sharper, more economical than the court-trained style she'd grown up with. "Why did you teach him?" she asked between forms. "Selim Main." Brennan lowered his blade. "Because he lost his father at 14. I couldn't be his father, but I could teach him how to stand straight when the world wanted him bent." She looked at the sword in her hands. Was he good at it? He was good at everything, when he believed it mattered. Neither of them said anything else about Selim, but for a long moment, both of them were thinking of him, and both of them knew it. That evening, Finn began the first page of a new book. On the cover in careful letters he wrote, "The Book of Those Forgotten." The first winter arrived early and stayed late. Snow came in October and didn't fully retreat until April, burying the half-finished walls under drifts that took half a day's labor just to clear from the doorways. It took the oldest woman among them, the one who had laid the first stones of the first house with her own hands, who had outlived 3 alphas and 2 wars before Eisenhollow, and who simply didn't wake one gray morning when the cold had dropped low enough to crack stone. They buried her beneath that house's foundation. The ground on the hill was already frozen solid. It took most of the able-bodied among them most of a day to break through it with picks and bare hands. "She built it," Seraphine said, when someone questioned the choice. Her breath fogged in the cold air. She should be part of it. No one argued. In the deepest part of that winter, the stretch of weeks where the sun barely cleared the ridgeline before sinking again, where every breath felt like swallowing ice, Seraphine walked alone to the grave one evening. She told no one where she was going. She sat down in the snow beside the cairn of stones marking it, not caring that the cold immediately began seeping through her cloak, and began to talk. She talked about the cold first, how it had a way of getting into places she didn't know existed, under the collar, between her fingers, behind her eyes. She talked about the walls, how slow the work was, how every stone they raised seemed to take twice as long as it should. She talked about the house, the dead woman's house, and how it was nearly finished now, how it would have a proper roof before the worst of the cold returned next year. And then, without quite meaning to, she talked about a man, far away, who likely had no idea she was sitting here in the snow at all. She didn't say his name. She didn't need to. She did not cry. Her voice stayed even, almost conversational, The way a person speaks when grief has found somewhere to go that isn't tears into words instead, into the simple act of being heard by someone, even someone who couldn't answer. Finn, on watch along the ridge above, heard all of it. The wind carried sound strangely in winter, and her voice traveled further than she knew. He didn't step forward. He didn't shift his weight, didn't let a single sound betray that he was there. He simply stood, breath held, until she finished and rose and walked back down toward the fires. That night, by the light of a single candle, he opened his book and wrote, "Today I understood who she is. Not a hero. Someone also learned how not to break." He closed the book before anyone could ask what he was writing. Later, by the communal fire, Brennan spoke again. Not as a story told to pass the hours, but as something he'd been waiting to say. "Why do you keep telling me about him?" Seraphine asked, not looking up from the flames. "Because you hate him for the wrong reasons," Brennan said, his voice pitched only for her. "And hatred built on the wrong reasons has a way of collapsing the moment it's tested." She was quiet for a long time. A fire popped and settled. Somewhere behind them, someone was humming an old tune, low and tuneless, just for the comfort of the sound. "When he first took the title," Brennan continued, "he didn't sleep for 3 months. Not properly. Every night, once the castle had gone quiet, he'd walk the halls alone, not patrolling, just walking. I know, because I followed him. 20 paces back every night, to make sure no one used the dark to settle old scores against a king too young and too unproven to have earned anyone's loyalty yet." "Why are you telling me this now?" Brennan looked at the fire, rather than at her. "Because winter does something to people. Strip away whatever they've been using to avoid the truth. I thought you might be ready to hear it now, even if you weren't before." She didn't answer, but she didn't tell him to stop either. Late that night, long after the fire had burned down, and most of the camp had gone still, Seraphine lay awake listening to the wind find every gap in the timber walls. Ildra's breathing beside her had long since slowed to the rhythm of real sleep. Everyone else had gone quiet. There was no sound left in the world, except the cold, the dark, and the occasional settling of wood as the shelter adjusted to the night's weight. In the coldest hour, the hour just before the first gray hint of dawn, when the temperature drops to its final degree and the world goes entirely still, as if holding its breath before it agrees to continue, she felt something. Distant, faint, like a fire seen from very far away across a dark plain, visible for a moment, then nearly gone, then present again, stubbornly there, despite the distance between it and her. The mate bond, thinned by years and miles but never fully severed, the way a scar never fully disappears even after the wound has long since closed. She had felt it in small ways throughout the year, a sudden warmth when the cold was at its worst, a faint certainty that somewhere he was still breathing, but tonight it came stronger than usual, as if the winter itself had stripped away the insulation she usually kept between herself and the awareness of it. She lay very still, eyes open in the dark, and didn't move toward it or away from it. She had been careful, in the months since leaving, not to examine it too closely the way a person avoids pressing on a bruise, not because they've forgotten it, but because they know exactly how much it still hurts. But now, in the cold, in the dark, in the small hours when defenses cost more than she had left to spend, she let herself simply feel it. The warmth at the other end of something she hadn't chosen and couldn't cut. She didn't know if he felt it too, whether somewhere far away in a castle she'd once called home. He was lying awake at this same hour, staring at the same dark above him, aware of the same faint thread running between them across all that distance. She didn't let herself wonder for long, but she didn't make herself stop feeling it either, and that, she realized later, was its own kind of answer. By the time spring thawed the last of the snow, Eisen Hollow had stopped feeling like a refuge and started feeling like a place. Some of the new arrivals, Seraphine knew, had been sent by the council's eyes and ears disguised as the desperate. She didn't turn them away. "Let them stay," she told Brennan. "And make sure they see exactly what we want the council to know, nothing more." One afternoon during sword practice, Finn, still adjusting to his right hand, tripped over his own feet and landed flat on his back in front of everyone. He lay there a moment, then sat up, dusted himself off, and announced with complete solemnity, "Right, I've decided the left hand is overweight anyway." The group around him broke into laughter, real, unguarded. Seraphine laughed too, and realized, mid-laugh, that it was the first time since the night of the decree. Ildra leaned toward Brennan. "She's coming back." Someone new asked what they should call her. Before Seraphine could answer, Ildra spoke first. "Her, that's all." 3 years passed before the news arrived with a traveling merchant. Lady Isolde, the woman the council had chosen to replace Seraphine, had refused the arrangement and was being held within the walls of Castle Draven. Seraphine received the news without expression. She did not sleep that night. 3 days later, a letter arrived. Pages written in Salem's hand about Isolde, about the pressure from the council, about the 3 weeks he had known and said nothing. The final line read, "I'm not writing to apologize. An apology isn't enough, and I know it. I'm writing because the council is preparing to erase Eisenhollow from the map, and I cannot stand here and watch that happen without warning you." She didn't burn it. She read it 4 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in a small wooden box alongside a silver ring no one knew she still kept. Only then did she go find Brennan. That night, Ildra found her sitting outside, staring at nothing. "A letter from him?" Seraphine didn't deny it. "He's warning us." And I don't know how I'm supposed to feel about that." Ildra sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Hating someone and trusting them at the same time isn't strange. It's just more painful. By week's end, word came that the council had declared war. Eisenhollow began to prepare. The valley woke to the sound of horns. Commander Rael Dumarn led the Allied forces down from the ridgeline as dawn broke, and Eisenhollow's defenders moved into position with the grim efficiency of people who had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this morning. Before the lines met, Finn found Seraphine while she fastened her armor. He pressed his book into her hands. "If I don't make it through this, make sure someone reads this." She pushed it back. "You'll read it to me yourself, after we win." He nodded. Neither of them believed it was a promise either could keep. He tucked the book back beneath his armor, against his ribs where it had always ridden. Halfway through the battle, the bond flared suddenly, undeniable, like a struck match in a dark room. Salem was here, fighting at the front lines with his own men, not behind them. She didn't know whether to hate him more for it, or respect him. Across the field, their eyes met. He stopped. In the middle of a battle blade moving on every side of him, he stood completely still, neither attacking nor defending, looking at her as if counting every wound on her body from across the distance. It was the most dangerous moment of his life, and he didn't move. She knew it too. What happened next, no one expected, not even the council's own commanders. Salem threw down his crown. He spoke the words renouncing his claim to the council's authority, and as he said them, he wasn't looking at the council. He was looking at her, as if the words were meant for her, and the rest of the field was simply listening in. She walked toward him. The fighting around them slowed, uncertain, as if the entire battlefield was waiting to see what would happen. "If you think a performance in front of 3,000 people is enough, I'm not doing this for you." She looked at him, not understanding. "I'm doing this," he said, "because I can't watch this happen anymore and still look at myself afterward." She raised her hand, not in greeting, not quite a weapon either. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her by the wrist, not the hand. The wrist, where the pulse beat closest to the surface. Neither of them spoke again. The battlefield around them held its breath. 43 graves were dug in the days that followed. Finn survived, but barely a wound to the chest that the healers worked over for 2 full days, while Seraphine sat beside him, refusing to leave. Brennan and Selim met for the first time in years. Brennan looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "You're all late." "I know. She built this without you." "I know. Don't ever forget that." It was the only time in living memory that anyone had seen Selim lower his head to another man. Selim worked with his hands for the first time in his life badly, at first. No one had ever taught an Alpha King how to lay a wall. His first attempts leaned, gaps showing daylight between stones that should have fit flush. He made mistakes. He redid them without complaint. Sleeves pushed to his elbows, knuckles scraped raw, the same hands that had held a sword since childhood, now learning the entirely different language of stone and mortar. A child from the settlement, taking pity on him, came to show him how to set the stones properly, small hands pointing, adjusting, and correcting the angle of his wrist. Selim laughed the first time in over a year, a sound rough with disuse, like something unlocking. From the rise above, Seraphine watched him work. The afternoon light had gone golden low, the kind that made even broken things look gentler than they were. Below, Selim knelt in the dirt, sleeves rolled, armor discarded somewhere out of sight, listening with genuine attention as the child explained again, patiently, where the next stone went. She told herself she had come up here for the view. The valley did look different from this height. She could see how much had been rebuilt, how the new walls followed the lines of the old ones. But her eyes kept returning to him, to the line of his shoulders as he lifted another stone, to the way he tilted his head, listening to a 9-year-old as if the boy's instructions were the most important thing he'd heard all week. There was something in watching him fail at something so small, so ordinary, and keep trying anyway, something that pulled at a thread she'd thought she'd cut clean through. She stood there long enough that the light shifted, long enough that her own shadow stretched thin across the grass behind her, long enough that Ildra, climbing the rise to find her, stopped a few paces back, followed her gaze down to the wall, and the man kneeling beside it, and turned and walked back down without a word. That evening in the War Council, Selim proposed a preemptive strike against Hagen's forces. Seraphine refused. The argument escalated until he said something he couldn't take back. "You lost once because you refused to do what was necessary. Do you want to test that again?" The room went silent. She looked at him, and for the first time, let something show on her face in front of others. Not hurt, not anger. Something colder than either. "Out," she said, to him alone. When the room had emptied, she spoke, low and even. "You will never use my pain as a weapon in that room again, never, whether you're right or wrong." "I'm sorry." It wasn't an apology for the proposal. It was an apology for the sentence he'd just spoken. She held his gaze for a long moment. "I'll consider your proposal," she said finally, and walked away, leaving him standing alone with the sound of the door closing behind her. Among the refugees who'd arrived months earlier, Finn had noted a small detail in his book. A young man named Edric, and his sister Isolde, fleeing toward Eisenhollow from the direction of Hagen's outer territories. Edric had mentioned, in passing, an older sister still trapped behind Hagen's lines, too ill to flee. A small detail. No one paid much attention to it at the time. After the strike on Hagen's outer holdings, refugees streamed toward Eisenhollow. Among them was Isolde, having escaped Castle Draven 2 weeks earlier with the help of a loyal servant, hiding in Hagen's lands because she believed it far enough away. Seraphine recognized her instantly. For a moment neither of them moved. The entire shape of what could happen next hung between them, visible to both, unnamed by either. Isolde spoke first. "I didn't choose this. I want you to know that before you kill me or send me away." A long silence. "I don't kill those who don't deserve it," Seraphine said finally. "Will you let me stay?" "If you can be useful, yes." Edric, her brother, chose to stay as well. That evening, Seraphine sat alone, sharpening her sword. Selim approached and sat at a careful distance, far enough not to crowd her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold night air. "You don't have to do this," he said. "She's done nothing wrong." Still. Seraphine paused, blade resting against the whetstone. "Did you feel anything for her?" He met her eyes directly. There was no hesitation in it, no softening or deflection. "No, never." She resumed sharpening, as if the question hadn't mattered. "Good," she said. But her breathing after that was steadier than it had been all evening. A private message arrived from Hagen. "You took something promised to me. I will take everything you have." Hagen brought 500 men. Edric's older sister, the one mentioned only in passing months ago, filed away because Finn's careful handwriting had been taken by Hagen as leverage. When the moment came, Edric chose her over Eisenhollow. He lowered his weapon and turned weeping, and through the noise of battle, he said one word to Seraphine. "Sorry." He wasn't a villain. He was a man with no good choices. Salem killed him. Afterward, he looked at Isolde, who had just watched her brother die. There were no words for it, only the look that passed between them, carrying everything that words would have made smaller. Commander Rial Dumarne fell in this battle, one of Hagen's 2 commanders eliminated. It wasn't enough. Hagen's numbers were overwhelming. Seraphine and Selim fled through the tunnels beneath the valley, tunnels they had helped dig themselves 3 years ago, in case of exactly this. At one collapsed section, they had to crawl through together, in total darkness, with nothing to navigate by except the warmth of the other's body. Selim took her hand and led her. He remembered the tunnel's layout from when they'd built it. It was the first time he had held her hand since that night in the bedroom 3 years and a lifetime ago. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them let go until they saw light again. At the section where the ceiling had partially caved, they pressed flat against the rubble and moved one at a time. When his armor caught on a rusted bracket overhead, a buckle tore free and clattered somewhere into the dark behind them. He didn't stop. There was no time, and no point, and the sound of it falling was swallowed by the earth. Eisenhollow fell. 53 survivors made it into the wilderness. Finn was among them, badly wounded in the chest, still clutching his book against his ribs, the leather covered dark with old blood that had dried before anyone could clean it. The wound would never fully heal, a quiet warning of what was to come, though no one said it aloud that first night. The camp they made was barely a camp at all, no fires, in case Hagen's scouts were still tracking them. Just bodies huddled close for warmth in the lee of a rock outcropping. By the time everyone had finally gone still, the sky had cleared, and a hard scatter of stars showed through the bare branches overhead. Seraphine sat with her back against a tree, eyes dry, staring, at nothing in particular, at a point in the dark where the valley used to be. She didn't think about any of it directly. She thought about small things instead. The exact weight of the hammer she'd left behind, the particular creak of the door to the room that had been hers, the smell of bread in the mornings. It was someone's turn to bake. Small things, because the large ones were too big to hold. Selim sat a few paces away, awake, unable to sleep. He'd taken the first watch and given it up to no one, though by now it had been hours past when someone should have relieved him. The tears came without warning silently, the way they come when a person has been too exhausted to hold them back any longer. She didn't make a sound. Her shoulders didn't shake. Just the slow, steady tracks of it down her face, catching what little starlight there was. Selim didn't move closer. He didn't say anything. He simply stayed close enough that she knew he was there, far enough that she didn't feel watched, and didn't feel the need to compose herself for an audience. He kept his eyes on the dark tree line, giving her the privacy of his profile, rather than his gaze. It went on for a long time. Long enough that the stars overhead shifted, just slightly, the way they do over the course of an hour. When the tears finally stopped, not because the grief had passed, but because the body, too, ran out of tears eventually, she sat very still, feeling hollowed out and strangely lighter at once. Selim moved then, finally, slow, deliberate, no sudden motion. He shrugged his cloak from his shoulders and laid it gently over hers, careful not to let his hands touch her, careful not to make the gesture into anything more than what it was. "Sleep?" he said quietly. His voice was rough, the way voices get after hours of silence. "I'll be here tomorrow." She didn't answer. She didn't trust her voice yet. But her hand found the edge of the cloak heavy, still warm from his body, and pulled it closer around her shoulders. And when he reached, hours later, to take it back before dawn, she had not given it back, and he didn't ask for it. The next morning, Seraphine addressed what remained of Eisenhollow. 53 faces, exhausted, watching her with the particular attention of people who needed to be told there was still a reason to keep walking. "We lost the valley. We did not lose what the valley was for." She let that settle. "We rebuilt. Somewhere else if we have to, as many times as we have to." Then, turning slightly, "And Selim, from this point, you are not an advisor. You are one of us. Same conditions, same risks, same graves if it comes to that. If you cannot accept that, now is the time to say so, not later, when it's inconvenient for both of us." Selim didn't hesitate. "I'm staying." 2 words. No qualification, no appeal to his rank, or anything he'd once been. Seraphine held his gaze a moment longer than necessary, then nodded once, and turned back to the rest of them, but something in her posture, just slightly, had eased. Before they broke camp, Finn called her over. He looked smaller than usual, pale from blood loss, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Take it," he said, pressing his book into her hands. His grip on it was looser than it should have been, the strength in his fingers less than even yesterday. "I'm not sure I have the strength to keep writing if we go into another fight, and someone has to keep it safe either way." She held it for a moment, feeling its familiar weight, the soft give of its worn leather cover. Then she tucked it alongside the ring and the letter in the small wooden box she still carried against her ribs, the same box that had survived a battle, a tunnel, and now this. 3 things that shouldn't matter, that she couldn't make herself leave behind. In the neutral lands, Isolde proved valuable in ways no one had asked of her. She knew the council's inner workings, the politics, and the weaknesses of every alpha who served it. She offered the information freely, with a precise memory, and a complete absence of hesitation. She wanted to see the council fall as much as anyone. The alliance building took time. More time than any of them wanted. Nearly 2 years of negotiations conducted by candlelight, of messengers sent on roads that changed hands with the seasons, of Seraphine learning to speak to lords who had every reason to fear the wrong choice. The careful, invisible work that never appeared in anyone's account of how things changed, but without which nothing would have. One night, over a map by candlelight, Selim explained a weakness in the alliance's lines. Seraphine pointed to a position on the parchment. "Here." He looked their hands close on the map, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. He didn't pull his hand back. She didn't pull hers back either. Yes, he said, quietly, as if he weren't talking about the map at all. Later, on a ridge overlooking the gathering forces below, Selim spoke without looking at her. Do you know what this looks like given everything you lost to get here? What does it look like? He turned to her. It looks like something worth losing everything for. She looked down at the valley below. It's not finished yet. No, he said, but it's real. After a successful night raid, Seraphine took a wound to her side not deep enough to be dangerous, but deep enough to need stitching. The healers were occupied with worse injuries. Selim did it himself. She sat on a fallen log, half her armor removed, the torn edge of her tunic peeled back to expose the wound along her ribs, long shallow at the edges, deeper near the center where the blade had caught bone. He knelt before her, a curved needle already threaded, and for a moment neither of them moved. This will hurt, he said. Not a question. I know. He began. She sat very still, her hands braced on the log on either side of her, and watched his face instead of his hands. He wasn't looking at her, he was watching the needle, watching the thread pull through skin, his jaw tight with each pass, as if he were the one absorbing the pain, rather than causing it. A muscle worked in his cheek every time the needle entered. The fire nearby had burned down to a low orange glow, just enough light to work by, and in that light she could see small details she'd never had reason to notice before: the faint white line of an old scar through his eyebrow, the way his dark hair had fallen forward, damp with sweat from the night's fighting. The gray of his eyes deepened almost to black in the dim light. His fingers were cold from the night air. Her blood was warm where it ran along her side. When he held the thread in place to tie off a stitch, his fingertip rested against her skin a moment longer than the task required, barely a second, but long enough that she felt it everywhere. Then he seemed to realize it, and pulled his hand back too quickly, as if he'd touched something hot. Sorry, he said. His voice was lower than usual, unclear whether he meant the wound or the moment before it, or both. Don't, she said. Don't stop. He continued. The needle moved again, slower now, more careful. When he was nearly finished, his face was close to hers, close enough that she could hear him breathe, and could feel the warmth of it against her jaw. She found she had stopped breathing entirely, and made herself start again, slow and even, matching the rhythm of his hands. When he tied off the last stitch, he sat back on his heels, and this time, instead of looking away, he looked at her. Gray eyes met hers in the small firelight, and for one long moment, neither of them looked away. The fire popped softly. Somewhere across the camp, someone laughed at something, the sound distant and unimportant. Done, he said finally. The word came out rougher than he probably intended. I know, she said. Her voice was quieter than usual, barely above the crackle of the fire. Thank you. It was the first time she had ever thanked him for anything, not for the crown he'd thrown down, not for the warning letter, not for any of it. For this, for the careful, deliberate slowness of his hand. He didn't answer right away. He simply nodded, once, and reached for a strip of clean cloth to bind the stitches, and if his hands lingered slightly longer than necessary as he wrapped it, neither of them mentioned it. 2 days later, after a second raid in which Isolde had served as a guide through territory she knew better than any of them, Finn sought Seraphine out before she retired. He looked worse than he had in weeks, the old chest wound pulling at his breathing in a way everyone noticed and no one mentioned. He held out his hand for the book. I want to add something, he said. Before the next one. She gave it back to him without question. He sat by the fire for a long time, writing in his careful hand, and she left him to it. That same night, a raid she hadn't been told about came from the east, a small force, fast, targeting the camp's edge where Isolde was posted. Finn was there. He wasn't a fighter, had never been, not really, but he was there, and he put himself between the blade and Isolde. And that was the end of it. Before he died, he pressed his book into Isolde's hands. Not Seraphine's. Isolde's, because Seraphine was still fighting, still unreachable on the other side of the camp, and because Finn had always had an instinct for which hands a thing should pass through next. He had understood, in the way that quiet people sometimes understand things that louder people miss, that Isolde was the right link in the chain, that she would know to give it back when the time came. "Don't lose this," he said. She didn't. When Seraphine came back to find him already gone, the fire nearby had burned down to its last coals, and the camp had gone completely still, the way it goes still only when something irreversible has happened. She stood over him for a long time in silence. The grief arrived differently than she'd expected, not as a wave, but as a sudden, permanent subtraction. A shape removed from the world that the world did not adjust to fill. She thought absurdly of the night she'd set his broken arm at the river, how he'd watched her hands instead of flinching, how he'd asked if it hurt and meant it for her. She thought of the entry she hadn't known he'd written until Isolde told her, someone also learning how not to break. She hadn't known when he wrote it, that she'd had a witness. She was glad now that she had. His death struck both women harder than either expected, and in the long quiet afterward, sitting together over the body of the boy who had recorded both of their stories without being asked, an unlikely bond formed between them. Not spoken, not named, only there, the way the most durable things often are. Cormac Stonecrest reinforcements arrived just in time, turning the tide. When word reached Lord Aldrich Voss of the defeat, he didn't order an execution. He sat in silence, listening to the full report, and then spoke. "We made this, when we turned marriage into a political tool, when we exiled the strongest wolves for daring to refuse. We didn't create enemies. We created leaders." He swept the documents from the table. "Attack, and this time, don't stop." Privately, Countess Elena Vale sent word to Seraphine. "I cannot declare myself publicly yet, but I want you to know I am listening." In the neutral lands, before Seraphine even stepped forward, Isolde rose before the gathered crowd and told her own story. "I was the one chosen to replace her. No one asked my opinion, and when I refused, they imprisoned me. If anyone here believes the council protects tradition out of love, ask me." The crowd was still, not the silence of indifference, the silence of a room full of people recognizing something they'd suspected for years, finally spoken aloud by someone who had no reason to lie and every reason to be afraid. Elena Vale stepped forward after her. Her words carried weight precisely because they followed Isolde's, because a countess agreeing with a prisoner said something that neither alone could have said. Standing beside Selim, watching Isolde speak, Seraphine said quietly, "I didn't expect her to do that." "I did." She glanced at him. "Since when?" "Since the day you let her stay without asking why you were doing it." She didn't answer. They stood close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them stepped away. The warmth of it was ordinary, easy, the kind of closeness that arrives without announcement, after long enough. The ridge above Eisenhollow was cold, the wind carrying the first edge of autumn down from the higher peaks. Below, the valley's lights flickered small fires, lanterns hung along the new walls, the sound of voices carrying faint and warm in the night air. Seraphine pulled her cloak tighter and didn't go down. Selim found her there, the way he'd found her on a dozen ridges and rooftops over the years, never asking how he knew where to look. He spoke about the first time he'd ever seen her long before the council had proposed any arrangement, long before either of their lives had become what they were now. "You were arguing with 3 elders about tax law. You were 19. They were all over 50. You didn't concede a single point." His voice was quieter than she'd heard it in years, the formal edges worn away by the dark and the cold and the absence of anyone else to hear. I remember thinking that's a person who will never bend just because someone older tells her to. I don't remember you being there. I know. A faint, almost rueful note. I was standing in the corner. No one looks at the corner. He reached into his coat and took out the ring. It caught what little moonlight there was, small, simple, the same ring she'd pressed into his palm years ago in front of an entire court. He turned it over once between his fingers before holding it out, not quite offering it yet, just letting her see it. I've carried this every day for 3 years, he said. In my coat, close enough to hold whenever. He stopped, searching for the rest of the sentence. There were nights I held it, and wondered where you were. Not to find you again. Just to know you were still alive somewhere. Some nights that was enough. Just that. Seraphine took the ring from his palm and held it up to the moonlight, turning it slowly, watching the faint silver catch and lose the light. For a long moment she said nothing, and then she reached into the fold of her cloak, where the small wooden box had ridden against her ribs for years, through 2 battles and a winter and everything in between. I've kept something of yours for 3 years too. She held out a small broken buckle, twisted metal, half its clasp sheared away, one edge still rough where it had snapped from the bracket in the tunnel. Salem looked at it without recognition for a moment, and then something shifted in his expression slowly, like a memory surfacing from deep water. The tunnel, he said. It came off your armor in the dark. I heard it fall and we were moving too fast to stop, and I don't know why I reached back for it. I didn't even know what it was until morning. She looked down at it in her palm. I told myself I'd throw it away. I never did. He looked at the small piece of metal in her palm, then at her face as if trying to reconcile the weight it clearly carried with how little it was worth. Then gently he closed her fingers around it. Keep it, he said. In return, I'll keep this. He closed his own hand around the ring. Until you want it back. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of wood smoke up from the valley. The silence had a different quality than it used to. Not the silence of things unsaid, but of things finally understood and not needing to be repeated. She kissed him first. Not desperation. Not the kind of kiss born from believing tonight might be the last. This was deliberate. She rose onto her toes, slowly, giving him every chance to step back if this wasn't what he wanted, and he didn't. He went still instead, the way he had on the battlefield years ago, looking at her as if to be certain this was real and not something his mind had built out of exhaustion and longing. She didn't step back. He leaned down to meet her, and the kiss was unhurried, careful, the kind that 2 people give each other when they have already lost everything else and have nothing left to prove by rushing. When it ended, neither of them moved away. His forehead rested against hers, and for a long moment they simply stood there, breathing the same cold air, the valley's lights flickering far below. We should go down, she said eventually. She didn't move. In a minute, he said, and didn't move either. One morning, Isolde asked, if everything had happened differently, do you think we'd have become friends? Seraphine considered it. No, we'd never have met. Then I suppose, Isolde said. I'm almost grateful everything went so badly. Isolde placed Finn's book in Seraphine's hands. You should reread what he wrote about you. It was the only time Seraphine ever read about herself, through someone else's eyes, moments she hadn't known anyone was watching, recorded with quiet, careful attention by a boy who'd believed history needed to be written by someone who wasn't going to be remembered for writing it. She read it slowly, in the early morning when the camp was still quiet, and when she reached the entry about the winter grave. Today I understood that she is not a hero. Someone also learned how not to break. She sat with it for a long time, The book closed in her lap before she put it away. She placed it back in the wooden box alongside the ring and the buckle. 3 things that shouldn't have survived. 3 things she'd carried without knowing why, until now. 5 years passed. Then decades. Mireille arrived at Eisenhollow not because she'd heard a story, but because she had read one. A single page of Finn's book had survived and traveled, copied in careful handwriting, and passed from hand to hand, through holdings and border towns and places the council had once believed it owned. She had learned to read specifically, so she could understand it, had taught herself from a charcoal rubbing on salvaged cloth, letter by slow letter, because the page had told her there was something worth understanding. Seraphine handed her the book. This was written by someone who never wanted to be remembered. We won't let him be forgotten. Mireille held it with the particular care of someone who already understood what they were holding, both what it was made of and what it had cost. That evening, Selim took out the broken buckle kept all these years in the same coat pocket, traveling the same distance the ring had traveled, through the same battles and winters. Do you know what this is? She looked at it. Your buckle. No, he said. This is the reason I'm still here, because someone reached back for it in the dark, in the middle of a tunnel with no light and no time to spare, and kept it for 3 years without knowing why. And that person was worth staying for. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the buckle from his palm, turned it once in her fingers, the rough edge where it had snapped, the weight of it, the small ugliness of a thing that had outlasted everything beautiful, and placed it back in his hand, closing his fingers around it. Then keep it, she said. You've always known what to do with things worth carrying. Outside, Mireille was already writing, not copying Finn's words her own, in her own voice, the beginning of a record that would outlast all of them. Young wolves like her were finding each other across distances the council had once believed kept everyone safely apart. They were corresponding in coded letters and shared books, and the language of a story that had been set down by a boy with one hand who had believed, absolutely, that someone would eventually need to read it. An idea, once it takes root in enough different soils, cannot be killed by burning any single field. Seraphine stood at the window for a long time after Selim set down the buckle, watching Mireille work by firelight below. She thought about Finn the way he'd looked that first night, one hand in an old soul and a book already open. She thought about a winter grave and the words he'd written by a single candle that she hadn't known about for years. She thought about how the thing you leave behind is never the thing you plan to leave. It's always something smaller, something you did quietly, something someone else had to tell you that mattered. Finn had never wanted to be remembered. He'd wanted the history to be remembered. The difference had mattered to him, precisely the way it doesn't matter to history at all, which records the hand that held the pen, regardless of what that hand intended. She understood that now in a way she hadn't when he was alive. She was glad she'd had time to understand it. Eisenhollow still stood. Outside its walls, the world it had made was just beginning. Some love stories don't end with a grand gesture. They end with a broken buckle kept in a coat pocket for 3 years. With a ring never given away. With 2 people standing on a ridge in the cold, saying we should go down and neither of them moving. Seraphine didn't wait to be saved. She built something from ash, buried her grief in frozen ground, and kept walking when there was no reason left to. Selim didn't chase her. He showed up late, imperfect, with nothing left to offer except his hands and his willingness to stay. That's the thing about real devotion. It doesn't announce itself. It lays stones badly and redoes them. It sits 3 feet away in the dark and doesn't ask for anything. It carries a useless piece of metal across years of silence just to have something that was once close to you. The most enduring things are never the beautiful ones. They're the ones that refuse to be put down. If this story landed somewhere in your chest, drop a comment and tell me which moment got you. Was it the battlefield? The tunnel? The Ridge? Your comments are genuinely what keep these stories coming, so if you want more, hit like, subscribe, and bring a friend who needs a good story tonight. Thank you for reading. See you in the next one.